Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here in Kansas City and to be able to give this presentation to you. We'll have, I believe, a period of question and answer after the presentation is over, and I'll be happy to fill in any questions that you may have, or hopefully so. In talking about the first Transcontinental Railroad built in the 1860s, the context of the railroad comes within the broad scope of American self-imagery, often characterized by manifest destiny, particularly from the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. In this self-image, the nation, the people of the nation saw themselves, or at least some of them, as the nation having a manifest destiny, an obvious destiny to extend across the continent and to include the whole continent. Their self-imagery included the movement of civilization as they saw it from the east to the west, driving the wilderness and the wild inhabitants before them, as this imagery is actually shown in this famous painting. On a more prosaic level, California had become part of the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War. Gold was very promptly discovered, and suddenly large numbers of people were moving from the east and from other parts of the world to California. Communications between the East Coast and California were a bit difficult at the time. For instance, many people would travel by sailing ship around South America, around Cape Horn, which was known for cold travel, heavy seas, also a long voyage involving some months. Always the chance of hurricanes or other misfortune and shipwreck along the way. The alternate was across the isthmus in Central America, either the Panama route or the Nicaraguan route. You could have a cruise up the river with a few eventualities along the way, and then a nice little land traverse across the isthmus to complete the voyage, or your travels across land, and then the steamships on the other side. By the early 1850s or mid-1850s, the Panama Railroad had been completed, arguably the first, if you will, transcontinental railroad, at any rate, the first railroad to connect the Atlantic with the Pacific. An oddity of the Isthmus of Panama is that you would arrive at the Atlantic port, board the railroad, and travel southeast to get to the Pacific Ocean because of the shape of the Panama in that region. In any case, you would then have steamship travel, first coming on the Atlantic side down to Panama, and then on the Pacific side, another set of steamships to carry you up to California, with occasional difficulties along the way for that route also. There was, of course, the route across the continent. You could travel, spend some months by wagon train going across the continent. This view, not only to California but other points, this particular view is of a group of Mormon immigrants arriving in Utah by wagon train. You could get acquainted with the locals on the Great Plains. And if you didn't have your timing quite right when you got to the far mountains, you could have the experience that the Donner Party had of starting late, getting delayed, and then getting trapped in the mountains with snow. The view on the right-hand side is stumps of some of the trees that the Donner Party cut while snowbound. That gives you an indication of how deep the snow actually was. Pony Express to speed communication was started in 1860, ran for a total of 18 months. Its fame and history far outstretches its actual existence. It was quickly replaced by the first transcontinental telegraph, which was completed in the fall of 1861. And the very first message sent over that telegraph by the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court to Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., was a message in part to assure Lincoln of the loyalty of California to the Union as the Civil War was getting going in those early years, and the Union was facing great challenges. We talk about passenger travel. Freight hauling, on the other hand, certainly did not take the overland route to reach from the east to the west. That would generally be accomplished by sailing around Cape Horn. Sailing ships were slow, but they were not that expensive to operate, and so any freight hauling generally went that route. But within the Intermountain West, freight hauling to supply mines in Nevada and Utah, Idaho and Montana, coming out of California, often would use the early freight trains. Here you see an 18-mule team pulling 4 wagons, a whole different take on a wagon train. In the early years, coming out of California, the Placerville route, which is roughly U.S. Highway 50 these days, was the preferred route out of California. In the very early 1860s, an additional route, the Dutch Flat and Donner Lake Wagon Road, was constructed, actually constructed by the same associates who ultimately built the Central Pacific. And the wagon road, in fact, served as a support infrastructure in the building of that railroad. The first railroad in California, the Sacramento Valley Railroad, started in Sacramento and ran up to Folsom, connecting with the Placerville route that I referred to. It started on the waterfront in Sacramento. Here you see an image of the inaugural run in 1855. The way that transportation worked would be that the deep sea ships would come into San Francisco, and then there would be river steamers and sailboats that would carry freight from San Francisco upriver to Sacramento. Sacramento was about the head of reliable navigation. Above Sacramento, during certain parts of the year, the rivers would get very shallow, and so you couldn't reliably reach much beyond Sacramento year-round. So Sacramento was a major center for transportation, for shipping. It also fairly quickly became the state capital. The Sacramento Valley Railroad was laid out by a young engineer named Theodore Judah, who had been working in the East in New York, came highly recommended, and was specifically brought out, induced to come out to California in order to do the surveying for the Sacramento Valley Railroad. Judah was already interested in the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad, became a major advocate of it in his years in California, in fact, to the extent that he was known in some circles as Crazy Judah, because he was so fixated on that. He was involved several times in lobbying in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Transcontinental Railroad legislation, and was very, very active. He was one of the organizers of the Central Pacific when it was formed in 1861. And it was his vision that persuaded the merchants that founded the railroad to come into that venture, because he had found a route across the mountains. In the 1850s, there was a great deal of interest nationally in a transcontinental railroad. This had started as early as the late 1830s and early 1840s. In the early 1850s, the government sponsored a series of surveys of different routes. Between 1853 and 55, a number of Army detachments with surveyors and instruments were mapping out potential routes. Of course, in this time period, in the lead up to the Civil War, there was a great debate over which route would be the most appropriate route. The southern states, of course, favoring a southern route, the northern states favoring the central or northern route. And it was not possible to move beyond these surveys at that time, because there was not enough of an agreement to allow for support. With the beginning of the Civil War and the withdrawal of the southern states from the legislature, of course, Congress was then able to act very rapidly in establishing the Pacific Railroad Act. The Pacific Railroad Act recognized the Central Pacific, which was already in existence, as being the officially designated western link of the Transcontinental Railroad. It created the Union Pacific as the potential eastern link, and then also recognized a couple of other railroads that had potential to be the eastern links. The first groundbreaking was in Sacramento, January 8th, 1863, for the Central Pacific. The painting across the top is in the depot in Sacramento today. There are no photographs of that ceremony. This is a reasonable representation of what that was like. One of the details about groundbreaking is that name is a bit odd for what actually took place. See, Sacramento on the river had a great deal of problems with flooding. In fact, just a year earlier, the town had been completely inundated with flooding. The city wanted to raise the levees, but couldn't exactly afford that. So the deal they struck with the railroad was that the railroad would raise the levees to the approved level, and in return, the railroad would have access to much of the waterfront for their own purposes. So groundbreaking consisted of Leland Stanford, at that time president of the Central Pacific, and also governor of California. They didn't believe in conflict of interest. Standing in front, there was a wagon brought up, and you can actually see a little bit on the left-hand side, a wagon full of dirt, and he took a shovel full of dirt out of the wagon and dumped it on the ground. That was how they did groundbreaking in Sacramento. The grading continued from there. The first rail was laid in October of 1863. The first locomotive was placed in service in November of 1863. I'll note in passing that first locomotive, the number 1, named Governor Stanford, modestly, is still in existence and is on display at the California State Railroad Museum today. A view along the waterfront. You can see that there are several warehouses for freight. The Steam Navigation Company had a warehouse, the Central Pacific Freight Depot, and then also a passenger depot. A small passenger depot was in place by 1865, as these photos show. Again, a view of the riverboat landing for the major communication between Sacramento and San Francisco. The freight house on the right, the Steam Navigation warehouse on the left. In late 1867 and early 1868, by this time the railroad was well under construction, and a much larger passenger depot was constructed on the waterfront. These two views show that structure. Again, the California State Railroad Museum, part of State Parks, has reconstructed a replica of that original depot, and today stands on the original site in Old Sacramento as part of our operation. From the east, it was not clear which railroad would actually be the eastern link. The way that it was set up, the Union Pacific Railroad, which was created by the legislation, was to start construction in Omaha. The Union Pacific Eastern Division was to start basically from Kansas City. Both were to build west, and the first one to reach the 100th meridian would become the officially designated railroad to build the rest of the line to connect with the Central Pacific. Union Pacific got off to a slow start. They had groundbreaking in December of 1863 and did virtually nothing until 1865, when they finally did more grading work, laid the first rail, and got their first locomotive in service. Union Pacific Eastern Division had groundbreaking here in 1863. By November and December of 63, they had already laid rail and had their first locomotive in service building east. Ultimately, however, it was the Union Pacific from Omaha that reached the 100th meridian first in October of 1866, held a big celebration and excursion in honor of that. A picture here shows the directors of the Union Pacific at the 100th meridian celebrating their triumph. The Union Pacific Eastern Division then returned to Congress and had their charter modified, designating Denver as their destination, and then a connecting line north from Denver to Cheyenne to connect with the Union Pacific there. In 1869, they changed their name to the Kansas Pacific Railroad. Bridge across the Missouri River, completed in July of 1869 here in Kansas City. So arguably the first through connection. Omaha didn't complete their bridge until about 1872. By 1880, the Kansas Pacific and the Union Pacific are merged into a single company. So ultimately, it all became Union Pacific. But meanwhile, we're back to building the Transcontinental Railroad. The surveyors out in the field, as they say, surveying under difficulties, out in the wilderness trying to string a line. There's a story, for instance, up at Donner Summit, where in order to get the alignment east of the summit, they literally had to lower a rodman over the side on a rope so that they could sight the line along the vertical cliff that they later had to tunnel through. So surveying was challenging, followed by difficult construction. Judah had some disagreements with the other partners in the Central Pacific. He headed east to try and get support to buy them out with their agreement. While crossing Panama, he contracted yellow fever, died shortly after he reached New York City, so he never saw the first rail laid on the Central Pacific. His assistant, Samuel Montague, took over as the chief engineer for the construction of the railroad and saw it to completion. So the Central Pacific, building up into the mountains through the grades. Prior to Judah's discovery of a route, it was commonly believed that the Sierra Nevada mountains could not be crossed by a railroad, that no possible rail line could be built there. The earlier surveys of the 1850s had envisioned going around the north end of the Sierra Nevada mountains and then out across the plains because they didn't think that a route could be found. Judah found the route that proved fully functional and is still used today. One of the first obstacles that was encountered by the Central Pacific was a deep cut through heavy gravel conglomerate known as Bloomer Cut, named for the nearby Bloomer Ranch. And in the construction of this, in these early years, they were not using Chinese yet. And James Strobridge, who was the construction boss, actually lost an eye in a premature explosion. Two other drillers there actually lost their lives in that incident. Generally, there were accidents along the way, but the Central Pacific, generally, California had a labor shortage at that time. And so the Central Pacific was actually rather jealous of its workers, and within the context of the times, tried to be rather more careful with loss of life, but life was short and often hard at that time for anybody and everybody. Cape Horn is often talked about. There's a famous story of Chinese hanging in baskets in order to carve the right-of-way. There are a couple of problems with this story, however. First of all, it wasn't hard granite. It was, as Montague described it in the annual report, soft, friable slate that yields readily to the pick and bar. It was not hard construction. And after the line was through, his next annual report talked about that it was considerably easier to build that line than they had expected. The other thing is that Cape Horn is not vertical. It's at about a 60-degree angle. and you couldn't hang over the side in a basket even if you wanted to. Also, in this early years, we're not entirely sure if the Chinese were yet being used in drilling and blasting. Further up in the mountains, they clearly were, but the Central Pacific only started employing Chinese in construction in the late 1864 and early 1865, and they gradually expanded their use as new skills were learned. So we're not even sure what role the Chinese may have played in this particular point in the construction. The Chinese went on to distinguish themselves much higher up. Building up the mountains, lots of cuts and fill, trying to balance the grading so that they could dig enough dirt in the cuts to equal the amount in the fills. This didn't always quite work out because in blasting, many times the blasting might send a lot of the rock and debris over the side of the cliff where they couldn't retrieve it. So they then had to go and do some quarrying for additional fill material. As was mentioned, this was all done with hand labor, one-horse carts, shovels and picks, black powder blasting and drilling to build this railroad. Very little mechanization at that time. Up at the summit, they started running into hard granite. The summit tunnel was especially difficult. It was a very long and hard cut. The granite was especially hard. With black powder, they were making some progress on something of the rate of about 2 feet a day. They started then to experiment with the new blasting material, nitroglycerin, which had a reputation for being extremely hazardous. So one of the ways that they addressed that was, instead of shipping nitroglycerin up to the mountains, they actually hired a chemist, built a laboratory up at the summit, and the nitroglycerin was manufactured on site. And so they didn't have the long transportation problem, which is one of the places where many accidents with nitroglycerin happened. In the report, the construction engineer afterwards did a report for the American Society of Civil Engineers and reported on all the tunnel construction. One of his comments was that there were only 2 blasting accidents up there, and both of those accidents would have happened with black powder as well as with nitroglycerin. So according to his testimony, there were no accidents that could be directly attributed to the use of nitroglycerin instead of black powder. I found newspaper articles of one of those 2 accidents. What had happened was that a blast had gone off but had not completely blasted. The white construction boss went in to check the blasting, was tapping around with his hammer, apparently set off the remaining material and killed him. We don't know about the second accident, but most of the actual drilling and blasting was done by Chinese at this time. In fact, there's a story told that the railroad was concerned about the slow progress. With nitroglycerin, they're making 4 feet a day instead of 2 feet a day. So they started at the 2 ends, drilling towards the center. They also cut a shaft down the center and then went out from there. So they had 4 faces that they were drilling all at the same time. It still took about 18 months to build the Summit Tunnel. They went down to Virginia City, silver mining area, and hired a group of experienced Cornish miners, thinking that they had a reputation for being very skilled at drilling and blasting. So they brought the Cornishmen up and put them to work at one face on the inside of the tunnel, and a Chinese crew on the other face, worked them for a month. The Chinese actually made a little more progress than the Cornishmen, so they sent the Cornishmen back to Virginia City and finished all the work with the Chinese. The Chinese build a well-deserved reputation of being very skilled at that particular job. I'll note something about the method of drilling. It's called double jack drilling. At the bottom you can see an example of a drill, the drill steel that would be used. This drill steel sits about this high. It's a star drill. It has the 4 faces. And the way that the drilling works is one man will hold the drill steel. He's called the shaker. The other man, the hammer man, will swing a sledgehammer to strike the end of the drill steel. After each strike, the shaker will pull the drill back just slightly, give it a little twist and a little shake so that the cutting faces move around in the hole. The idea is you're making a circular hole, and you have to move the drill bit around each time to get that circular hole through there. This is how they drilled their holes. No power drills, no steam drills operated on this railroad, nor on the Union Pacific, I believe. Black powder, they would drill a hole that was 2.5 inches around and stuff it with black powder and light it off. Nitroglycerin, because of its much greater power for explosion, they could drill an 1.5 inch hole. So one of the reasons that it was faster is they didn't have to drill as much rock. They could drill that hole faster because it was smaller in diameter. Also, the concussion of the nitroglycerin would shatter the rock much more readily than the black powder. There was a little problem with their use of nitroglycerin. After they completed the Summit Tunnel and a couple of others, they stopped using nitroglycerin. I'm not entirely sure, but my suspicion is they had a little problem of patent infringement. See, nitroglycerin had been patented by Alfred Nobel and had been licensed in the United States. The Central Pacific had not purchased a license, and so probably the patent suit reached a point where they needed to stop using it, or they probably also had to pay a little penalty out of that. But they went back to black powder for most of the rest of the construction. This is a view of the Summit Tunnel right at the very beginning, just starting construction. This is the eastern face. This is a view looking down upon that area of the Summit Tunnel. They had to work throughout the winter. They built houses there. During the winter, when the snow was deep, they actually built snow tunnels to connect the houses with the tunneling so that they could continue work. They were working 3 shifts a day, 3 8-hour shifts a day, round the clock, trying to drill this tunnel. As I mentioned, they also built a central shaft down. The structure on the right is the covering for the central shaft. They took an old locomotive, dismantled it, and hauled it up to the summit and used it as a hoist engine to lift the bucket full of rock and debris out and dump it and back and forth. After the project was over, they took the locomotive back down and reassembled it as a locomotive. The locomotive they used was the #1 locomotive from the Sacramento Valley, which they had acquired by this time. This is a view of the interior of the tunnel during construction. This particular view actually was very interesting to take. It's the eastern face, taken at sunrise, and the photographer actually used mirrors to help focus the light into the tunnel so that he would have enough light to take this picture. The Chinese, I'll talk a little bit about the Chinese experience. Chinese were paid roughly what the white workers were paid, with the exception that the white workers were provided with board. They were provided with food. That would be basic meat and potatoes. They would also drink the local water. It was noticed that the white workers had a tendency to have problems with what we know today to be waterborne diseases, dysentery and the like, from drinking contaminated water. It was noticed that the Chinese did not have this problem. The Chinese had to provide their own food. Well, they ate a traditional Chinese diet that included lots of greens and other things. They probably had a much healthier diet. They also did not drink water. They drank tea. Now, The gentleman in the lower view, Chinese tea carrier, is carrying tea to the construction workers. By the time they're drinking it, it may not be hot, but in order to make the tea, they started by boiling the water and thereby purifying it. Up at the summit area, through the hard granite, most of the tunnels did not need to be lined. Down at lower levels, where the ground was not so solid, they would have to build linings to help support the openings of the tunnel. The tunnel at the summit is tunnel number 6. The lower left view shows tunnel number 12 getting down towards Truckee, and you can see the lining that was built in there. After the railroad was completed to Promontory in May of 1869, the Central Pacific then completed a line from Sacramento into the San Francisco Bay Area. And as part of that line, they crossed a summit called Altamont near Livermore on the way to the San Francisco area. And there was a tunnel there. This in the coastal ranges. The lower right-hand view is that tunnel, and it is lined for its full length. Again, it depends on the type of soil and rock and material that they're tunneling through, whether or not a lined tunnel would be necessary or not. Union Pacific did not have nearly the steep mountains and nearly the number of tunnels that the Central Pacific did, but the Union Pacific did have some tunnels, especially as they came across the border from Wyoming and into Utah and down through Echo Canyon and Weber Canyon. Both railroads, as they approached Utah, contracted with local Mormon construction companies to do a lot of the railroad work. This particular view is a view of some of the Mormon construction workers working on a tunnel in probably Weber Canyon. Another view of tunnel construction on the Union Pacific. Again, you can see the spur of rock coming down and working on the tunnel through that. The rails and the cart to carry the overburden, the rock out to get it out of the way. And a close-up view, again, you can see the drill steel. The guy on the right is the shaker who's holding the drill steel, and you can see the size of the sledgehammer. And clearly the shaker wants that hammerman to be accurate. So once tunnels are drilled, grading is done, then it comes time for track laying. And the Union Pacific fairly early on had a very effective system. The Central Pacific, once they got out of the mountains, actually did a little bit of industrial espionage, learned about the method that the Union Pacific was doing, and then copied it and ultimately beat them at their own game. But the process would be that you would have crews that would carry the ties out in advance by wagons and lay the ties. You would then have the rail crews would have little rail carts that they would load the rail on from the end of where you could safely run steam engines. They would run the rails out to the end of the tracks. You would then have an 8-man crew on each rail, or a 4-man crew on each rail, pick up the rail, take it off the cart, place it into place. A couple of spikers would then drive some quick spikes at the two ends to hold it in place. They could then roll that rail cart forward for the next 2 lengths of rail, and then behind would be additional hammermen to spike the rail into final place on all the ties. So they could rapidly move forward. They would typically do 2 miles a day of laying rail. These are some other views. The rail cart itself was typically pulled forward by a horse that would run along beside the railroad, beside the ties. This particular view shows one of the Union Pacific horses that was known as Blind Tom. And the horse may actually have been blind, but with the lead of the crew running along the rail line, it could probably just keep along on the straight line and be led. At the end of the track, when the rail cart was empty, they would flip the rail cart off the track to the side so the next rail cart could go forward. They would then put the rail cart back on the line and with the horse take it back for another load of rail so that they could alternate and keep moving forward rapidly. Again, some views, engravings from the time period in the Harper's magazine showing the progress of rail laying with the carts and all. Union Pacific Eastern Division, very much the same process here. Again, you can see the horse with the rail cart, the ties laid out in advance, and the crews ready to lift the rails off, and then the workers behind to finish off the railroad after the initial rails were laid. Central Pacific, again, the same story. Here you can see some of the rail piled by the side off of the flat cars that the steam locomotives could bring up. They would pile the rail to the side and then bring the rail carts down and load those to carry the rail forward. A closer view out at end of track. Again, you can see several of the rail carts here, the ties extending off into the distance that had been hauled out by the wagons in advance. This is a close-up view of the Central Pacific rail carts that were used. The Nevada State Railroad Museum has recently constructed a replica of the Central Pacific rail cart using hardware off of historic rail carts from the 19th century. The rails that were used were iron, rolled iron rails. Steel rails were not in common use yet at this time. The iron rails going around some of the sharper curves didn't have as much spring to them as the steel rails had, so they would actually have to pre-bend the rails somewhat before they put them in place. The way that they would bend them would be to lay a couple of ties on the track, lay the rail between. They could use some levers then to bend it down, and then they would hammer on it with sledgehammers so that the rail would take a set and would hold that curve. And then when they got the curvature that they want, they could take that rail out and put it in place. And this is a Central Pacific rail crew bending the rails prior to placing them. Rail joints. When the railroad was constructed, common railroads in the United States today have what's called staggered joints, so that you'll have one joint here and one joint back here. That way, as the train goes along, it's not pounding so much, it's rocking back and forth a little bit. When you have opposite joints, one of the problems is that the wheels of the cars will actually pick the edge of the rail a little bit, and you'll get a little bit of a pound. When the rails are opposite, you get that pounding going right at that same spot together, and over a period of time, it actually wears the rails quite a bit. They weren't as aware of that at that time. Both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific used opposite joints. In Britain, they commonly used opposite joints, but there's a much higher degree of finish and leveling of the rails. The rougher rails in the West, they quickly found that staggering the joints made them last longer. The connection at the rail joints, initially the Central Pacific used what's called chairs. It'd be a plate of metal that would be cut and a couple of tabs rolled over to capture the rail at the edge, and then space for 4 spikes to go in, but the bottom web of the rail would actually be notched a little bit so that the spikes would catch and hold the rail in place, the two rails together. This was the common 1850s and early 1860s way of joining rails. Subsequently, both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific adopted what are called fish plates. With these, you would actually drill a couple of holes through the ends of the rails, and you would run bolts through with a strap of metal on both sides to hold it in place. this was a much more reliable way of joining the rails together. And in fact, its variant of that is what's still used today. So here we can see views both of the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific using fish plates to hold the rails together instead of the chairs. And again, you can see here that the joints are still opposite on both railroads. As I say, the Central Pacific ultimately outdid the Union Pacific in laying rail. There was, of course, an informal race developed to see which company could lay the most rail. Ultimately, the Central Pacific bet that they could do 10 miles a day, but in keeping with the way that the owners of the Central Pacific tended to work, they didn't like to leave many bets to chance. So first of all, they carefully choreographed the day so that they had everything in readiness, all the material set out ready in advance. The other thing they did was they waited until the Union Pacific had less than 10 miles of track to lay to Promontory, so that the Union Pacific would have no chance of topping them at 10 miles. On the grand day, they started work, and then they had a problem. They actually delayed one day on the process, because when they started the first day, I think they had, as I recall, a problem with the amount of rail that they had, so they had to prep one more day. They had a crew, their rail laying crews were largely white, often Irish workers. They had the crew to actually lay the rail, take it off the rail carts and put it into place. Then the large support crew behind them of white workers and Chinese workers to finish spiking and all the grading. We have the time card for the crew that laid the rail. The Irish workers here, the rail layers, and then the two spikers. As originally planned, they had a second crew standing by planning to relieve this crew after they broke for lunch. They had laid about 6 miles initially. They took a break for lunch, but this crew insisted that they would finish the job. So this crew laid the entire 10 miles in the one day without relief. They insisted on getting, well, obviously the glory and the prestige for themselves. They did get a bonus pay also, it's noted on the timesheet. Both railroads were required to build telegraph lines along the way, and also then to lease those out for, like, Western Union telegraph companies to have access to those. They used slightly different technologies for holding the wires in place. The upper view, the Union Pacific, you can see the cross arm, and then the typical type of insulator where you'd have a wooden stud and then a glass insulator on top, and then they would attach the wires to that. The Central Pacific used what's called a ram's horn insulator, patented design that was a little bit different. There was a hole that was bored in the cross arm, and this ram's horn insulator would be shoved up from the bottom. It would have two hooks that would come out, metal hooks, that the wire would be threaded around through to hold in place. They didn't need to have a separate wire then to tie it into place. They could just wrap the wire around and keep going. The lower right-hand view shows that Central Pacific insulator system. You can see the insulators hanging down. You can also note that there is a wire that is dangling down from there. This particular pole is at Promontory, and this is the wire that is hanging down in order to connect to the silver spike maul and the last spike, so that when they actually drive the last spike and make that electrical connection, the message will be telegraphed to the entire nation. More on that to come. Both railroads had numerous trussels and bridges to build, some of them low-lying bridges, some very high trussels. They used wood for construction. For most of these, wood was readily available, was fast and easy to work with, and so they could build really extensive structures out of wood. This promontory trussel was on the Union Pacific line. The photograph is actually taken from a fill that the Central Pacific constructed parallel to it. The two railroads actually built parallel for several miles in terms of grading. They didn't lay rails parallel, but they did grade parallel because it took a while before Congress had to decide exactly where the junction was going to be, where they were going to meet. So in the meantime, each one was trying to get as far as they could go. The Central Pacific actually did some grading up Weber Canyon in Utah. Union Pacific actually did some grading clear out into Nevada before it was finally settled to meet at Promontory. Again, a low-lying trestle on the Union Pacific at the Platte River near Omaha. Central Pacific also had high trussels that they built, such as the Secret Town trestle here up in the mountains. Some other views, sometimes you would actually have trusses that would be built into the trusseling to span part of the distance. So you'd have short bridge structures within the trussel, as several examples show here. Trusseling was also used on the approaches to more major bridges. Again, the bridges that were built, huge structures. The first Central Pacific bridge built on the outskirts of Sacramento was this two-panel Howe truss built across the American River. The railroad still crosses there, although on a much later steel bridge. I've walked down around this area. And again, the bridge had two panels of a Howe truss, a design very commonly used for wood construction on early railroads, and then approaches of trusseling to cover the floodplain. One of the advantages of the Howe truss design was that it maximized the use of wood and minimized the use of metal. The tie rods were the shortest length on that particular design to give the adequate support. Again, the long ravine bridge, the upper right-hand view shows the Howe truss and the high pillar that was built in the center. Fairly quickly, they covered this to give it more protection and to make the wood last longer. So most of the views show it with the covering in place. Only the earliest view shows it before it received its covering. And again, the long trussel approach for the long ravine bridge. Again, going across down the Truckee River Canyon, there were a series of river crossings that required bridges. The second crossing here, again, is a two-panel truss bridge built on a skew. Because they're not crossing the river at right angles, one panel of the bridge would be slightly offset from the other panel of the bridge, and then they would tie across in order to get the diagonal, because the center pier had to be perpendicular to the flow of the river so that it would not be less susceptible to damage. The view on the right is actually a composite of three views that show a few of the details of the bridge construction. The top chord is actually four timbers with spacers in between them to spread that. Again, there's a row of stringers down at the bottom that have ties across, but with the rail nailed to the stringers to carry that load across. Some of the longer bridges, they actually did a composite design, Howe truss panels with what's called a burr arch, a compression arch that would increase the strength of the bridge over the long span. These bridges were actually about 210 feet long in a single span. Modern engineers have a great deal of difficulty with these bridges calculating the load that can be carried on them. The reason is that under dynamic load, the Howe truss acts differently than the arch in terms of carrying the load. And so they have a great deal of difficulty trying to calculate what part of the load is being carried by the truss and what part of the load is being carried by the arch. The old-time engineers just overbuilt the structure and didn't worry about it. Again, a few more views of some of the trusses with the burr arch. These down in the Truckee River Canyon, some close-up views. The way that the arch was added is that on each plane of the truss, they would build a composite wooden arch on the inside and on the outside, and then would bolt across between, creating like a sandwich. So the truss panel would be the sandwich between the two, the inner and the outer arch, that were then bolted together and tied together to hold it in place. They didn't always use Howe trusses. This is the Dale Creek Bridge in southeastern Wyoming, built by the Union Pacific. You might actually better describe this as a viaduct. Extremely extensive, high construction. You can see the cables in place to help hold it in place so that it doesn't fall over. This railroad, this section, this bridge also had a very severe speed restriction because it would wobble as you went across. And in fact, the guidebooks spoke of people holding their breaths until they had gotten across the bridge for fear that it might fall. It didn't. But fairly quickly, it was replaced with an iron bridge. A few other views of the Dale Creek Bridge on the Union Pacific. This one was a very famous site on the railroad. The guidebooks always pointed this structure out. A few more views looking down upon it, and a more general view showing the general topography in the area. The Union Pacific had a problem coming down Weber Canyon. They had built a temporary Howe truss across a side stream at Devil's Gate. The problem was spring flooding. The spring flooding came along and undermined the bridge, threatened to collapse it. They had to go in with trussing to try and quickly give it a little bit of support. But as a result, the official Union Pacific train going to Promontory to the ceremonies was delayed because they couldn't get across the bridge. Ultimately, what they had to do was they uncoupled the cars after putting some reinforcements under the bridge, and they, by hand, rolled each car across the bridge to the other side. They couldn't get the locomotive across, so they had to bring a different locomotive up then to pull their official train on up to Promontory. Here's a couple other views of the temporary Howe truss that is being shored up. Within a few months, they replaced that Howe truss with a much longer bridge of a slightly different design called a post truss, a different patented design that has metal diagonals and an offset design. The Union Pacific used the post truss design on several of their bridges, including the bridge across the Missouri River at Omaha was a post truss patented design. So here's a couple of other views of the replacement Devil's Gate Bridge after it was put in the summer and fall of 1869. And a final view of it. In this particular case, it's an official Central Pacific train returning to the east, being pulled by the Union Pacific locomotive, but the official cars, the business cars of the Union Pacific, of the Central Pacific, are on this train, along with a Silver Palace car, sleeping car, being delivered to the Central Pacific, and then a flat car converted for sightseeing. So I'll talk very briefly about the official cars of the train that brought the major officials to the festivities at Promontory. The Central Pacific had a 2-car train. It consisted of the director's car, sometimes called the commissioner's car, and then a smaller subsistence car that carried provisions and also had sleeping quarters for the crew. And this is the 2-car train that brought the officials, Leland Stanford and people traveling with him, to the events at Promontory in 1869. In fact, this view here at Monument Point, just on the way to Promontory as they're going for the ceremonies, shows the official train pulled by the locomotive Jupiter. I'll note in passing, as I said before, the Union Pacific had to replace their locomotive when crossing the Devil's Gate Bridge. So the locomotive that was planned to be at Promontory was in fact not the locomotive that the Union Pacific got there. The Central Pacific also didn't get their original locomotive there. Coming down the Truckee River Canyon, the main train had passed. Some woodcutters didn't realize that a special was following. A big log rolled down next to the track. When the locomotive came along, it hit the log, damaged the locomotive. They had to limp on into Reno. They held the scheduled passenger train and connected the official cars to the passenger train for the trip across Nevada. The Jupiter was then probably selected in eastern Nevada at the end of that run to carry the official train on up to Promontory. And so the Jupiter and the locomotive 119 for the Union Pacific become the famous locomotives at Promontory. Almost nobody remembers what the other locomotives were. The Union Pacific arrived with a 4-car train. As with the Central Pacific, they had a director's car and a subsistence car. The subsistence car was a converted caboose. The director's car had been built in 1868. We're fortunate to have 2 photographs inside the director's car. In 1868, one of the directors, a man named Bushnell, took a tour of the railroad construction. The view at left is Bushnell with his party dining in the car. The view at right is taken in early 1869, shows some of the Union Pacific officials inside the car meeting. Thomas Durant, of some fame or infamy, and Sidney Dillon, John Duff, and Samuel Reed there inside the car. In addition, the Union Pacific had an official sleeping car, number 29, that was used for business excursion trips specifically. And then finally, the 4th car in the train was a Pullman sleeping car, Pullman Palace sleeping car. That's the car on the left-hand side. So it was a 4-car train that the Union Pacific brought to the festivities at Promontory. As I mentioned, in the last miles, the 2 railroads were building side by side. This view, sort of graphically representing that, appeared in Harper's Magazine. I like this view for a couple of reasons. For one, it shows sort of the relationships between differing peoples. Most of the Central Pacific workers, majority were Chinese. Many of the Union Pacific were white, especially Irish. And so this shows sort of the relationships between, and you have sort of antagonistic relationships shown at the far right. But in the center, you actually have what looks like an Irishman and a Chinese engaged in friendly conversation. And I point this out to show that relations between differing peoples is extremely variable, always is. And some people are just always antagonistic and competitive against the foreign, the different, the odd, whereas other people are much more open and interested in learning about different types of people, different types of customs, and interacting and interchanging between races. And that was certainly true with the Chinese in their experience in America. The people that they ran into were varied. Some people were extremely prejudiced. Prejudice is international, it knows no boundaries, and it knows no race. But other people are very open and accepting and interested in differing peoples. So anyway, coming up to the final scene, this picture taken again at Monument Point, actually a sort of a poetic imagery of the official Central Pacific train meeting a wagon train headed west. In this particular case, the wagon train was actually a supply train, but nonetheless, the imagery they recognized at the time of this contrast between the old way of travel with the wagon train, the new way of travel with the railroad, meeting together. As I say, the Union Pacific officials were delayed for a couple of days because of the Devil's Gate Bridge. So the Central Pacific officials arrived on May 7th, preparing for the May 8th scheduled celebration, only to discover that the Union Pacific was delayed. As a result, the Union Pacific on the 9th gave them an excursion down into the valley down near Ogden. The lower photo shows that excursion while the Central Pacific officials are twiddling their thumbs and waiting for the UP officials to appear. Then comes the grand event, May 10th, 1869. Both railroads are present. There are 3 photographers that are present to document the events that are transpiring. The Central Pacific had contracted with Alfred A. Hart to be their official photographer. Most of the Central Pacific photos that I was showing were taken by Hart, documenting the construction. So what did the photographers see of the event? Of course, when the actual celebration, the actual laying of the final rail, the actual driving of the last spike are happening, everybody clusters around. So this is what the photographer saw. Afterwards, the crowds could be separated out and a carefully staged photograph could be taken. This is the Hart photograph showing Leland Stanford in the center and Thomas Durant and some of the other officials. Hart also climbed on top of the Union Pacific locomotive, shooting across towards the Central Pacific locomotive. There was an Army detachment that was traveling to San Francisco, to the Presidio, and was traveling over the Union Pacific. Coincidentally, they were on the train that was there, so they formed an honor guard for the ceremony. You can see them lined up here. Also, the military band provide entertainment there at the festivities. After the celebrations were over, Alfred Hart posed the military band in front of the 2 locomotives and took these pictures to commemorate the military band there at Promontory. Andrew J. Russell, A.J. Russell, was the similarly contracted official photographer for the Union Pacific. Russell had been a Civil War photographer. During the battle, had honed his skills, was a highly skilled photographer, and he took some of the grandest images that we have of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. This particular view is taken from the Union Pacific side. Before the ceremony starts, you can see there's a gap between the Central Pacific in the background, the Union Pacific in the foreground, and the Union Pacific's last rail is sitting there in the track, waiting for the ties to be placed and the rail to be moved into place. Russell also climbed on top of the locomotive. In this case, he climbed on top of the Central Pacific locomotive, shooting the scene. And in fact, in this view, which is a large plate negative, you can actually see on the top of the Union Pacific locomotive, Hart with his camera taking the opposite view. I'll note that the flagpole to the right and telegraph pole, that basically marks the spot where the Union Pacific and Central Pacific met. It's often said that the Chinese were overlooked in all the ceremonies. This actually is not true. The Central Pacific chose a special crew of 8 Chinese specifically to lay the last rail for the Central Pacific in recognition of the vital work that the Chinese had done in building the railroad. They wanted to give honor and recognition to the Chinese for the work that they had done making the Central Pacific possible. So in this view, I can actually identify 3 of those 8 Chinese. This view taken by A.J. Russell of the Union Pacific, but showing 3 of the Chinese who have just laid the last rail for the Central Pacific and the very last rail laid in the Transcontinental Railroad. After the ceremony, again, the crowd was pulled apart and a careful staging here showing Union Pacific officials standing in front of their locomotive, taken by A.J. Russell. A quick note on how you distinguish Union Pacific track from Central Pacific track. Union Pacific ties were hand-hewn. They would take a small log and an adze and would chop it, give it a level service. It would have a chopped in shaped with an axe where they would cut it off. The Central Pacific ties had gone through a sawmill. They were square cut. And so you can easily recognize whether you're looking at Union Pacific or Central Pacific track just by looking at the ties. Again, what did A.J. Russell see of the actual driving of the last spike? Well, here's what he saw. And then again, after that ceremony was over, the crowd was parted so that the official view could be taken by Russell. This particular view, again, will have both Union Pacific and Central Pacific officials shown in here. Stanford holding his silver spike maul, Durant with his spike maul over his shoulder. In the foreground to the right, there's a little table. This is the telegraph table, where the line, the wire that came down from the telegraph pole came to a telegraph station, and then from there would be connected to the silver spike maul and the last spike, so that when they were touched together, that message could be transmitted across the country. And again, a little bit closer view of that last scene. You can see the table clearly to the right and the officials gathered around. And then afterwards, again, officials and then larger family members posed in front of the cars of the Union Pacific official train. The classic view taken, this is the most famous view of the driving of the last spike. I laugh a little bit about this. This particular view is taken after the ceremonies are over. The really important officials have already adjourned to their cars and are probably drinking heavily. This is the workers and the mid-level people gathering together. In the foreground, you have the chief engineers, Samuel Montague for the Central Pacific and Grenville Dodge for the Union Pacific, shaking hands. The next layer back, you have construction bosses, James Strobridge and Samuel Reed, again shaking hands. You have the two locomotive engineers holding out bottles to baptize the rails. Keep an eye on those bottles, more on that shortly. But note that the Central Pacific engineer on the left is holding one large bottle. The Union Pacific engineer on the right has two smaller bottles. I'll point out another thing in this photo. Let's see if I can actually do the pointer. Right there, right next to Samuel Reed of the Union Pacific, is an Indian, probably a Shoshone chief. We know several of the chiefs were present at the ceremony. There he is, right in the middle of the whole gathering. Now, people have often criticized and say, well, you see, the Chinese are just excluded. You don't see them at all. But here, an American Indian, Shoshone chief, right in the middle, nobody cares. Everybody's fine with it. I'll also make another note. After all this was over, Strobridge had a luncheon in his private residence car where he brought most of his construction bosses and gave them a luncheon to honor them. The 8 Chinese who had been brought for the ceremony were invited to that luncheon. When they entered the car, they received a standing ovation from all present in honor of the work of the Chinese and the vital work that they had done in building the Central Pacific. So they were recognized not only by the higher-ups, they were also recognized at the working level. Similarly, in Sacramento, when the celebration for the completion of the railroad was given, E.B. Crocker, one of the associates who were in building the railroad, if you will, the big bosses, giving a speech, devoted a considerable length of time to praising the Chinese and citing them and recognizing them for the vital work that they had done. So the Chinese were, in fact, recognized at the time. That's often forgotten in later years. Again, another view by Russell. Again, afterwards, the workers gathered around the two locomotives as the trains are sitting there. The third photographer was Charles Savage. He was a Salt Lake City-based photographer, and he came up. He had photographed during the construction, and he was at Promontory photographing the scene. Again, when the crowd was separated for Russell's photograph of the officials, Savage also was able to take his photograph here. But of the actual ceremony, well, let's just say that's what he saw of the ceremony. You can see a few heads poking up. We might be able to actually figure out, identify one or two of the major officials, but who knows what they're doing. He, along with Russell, took photos of the workmen and all gathered around. I want you to note carefully that the Central Pacific engineer now has the two small bottles. The Union Pacific engineer has the large bottle. We don't know who started with which bottles, so we don't know which photograph was taken first and which second, but clearly they exchanged bottles. The other thing that happened, again, a closer view. In this case, Dodge and Montague are not shaking hands. But then there's a second view by Savage where they are again shaking hands. But in this view, you can't see the engineer's hands at all. From the newspaper accounts, we know that they are reported to have baptized the junction with the contents of the bottles. What I suspect is happening is they've opened the bottles, they're pouring the contents out, and their hands are blurred because their arms are moving while they are baptizing the rail in this picture. Again, a much closer view, and you can see how the hands are blurred. The photographs that were taken here were shipped off to Eastern magazines and engravings rendered. Harper's Magazine used the Charles Savage view where the bottles were not visible. Using a bit of editorial license, they then drew in the engineer's hands as though they're reaching across to shake hands, because after all, they couldn't see what was going on because of the hands being blurred in the view. Leslie's magazine used the A.J. Russell view that showed the bottles prominently. Similarly, Russell served as a correspondent for Leslie's and provided much of the article of describing the situation, describing the events at Promontory that was printed in Leslie's magazine. We often hear of the last spike. There were actually 4 precious metal spikes that were used in the ceremony. The top spike on the left is the famous gold spike, the last spike. It had been made by David Hughes, or made for David Hughes, who was a prominent contractor in San Francisco. He felt that it was important that some token be manufactured to actually commemorate the event. He originally thought of having actually a golden rail that was prohibitively expensive. He settled for making a golden spike, which he then presented to, gave to Leland Stanford to take to Promontory for the ceremony. Up in Nevada, some people felt that it was appropriate to have a silver spike, actually hand-forged as opposed to cast. This was rushed at a last minute, forged in Virginia City, raced up to Reno just in time to catch the delayed Central Pacific special in order to go on to Promontory. After the events were over, it was returned to the people. It had not even been finally finished, and so it was a jeweler finished it off and did the engraving after the ceremony was over. The Hughes spike had been engraved before it went, And in fact, the Hughes spike contains the date May 8th for the ceremony, because that's when the event was scheduled to be before the delay. The lower view is an engraving. The San Francisco Newsletter in San Francisco newspaper also provided a golden spike. In this case, it was, I believe, gold-plated as opposed to solid gold, again engraved. It's not entirely clear what became of it. The Hughes golden spike at the top and the Nevada silver spike today are on display at Stanford University. And so they are still around with us. The fourth spike that was created, the one on the right-hand side, was representing Arizona. The newly appointed territorial governor of Arizona had not yet set foot in the territory of Arizona. He had been active up on the Comstock in Nevada and down in San Francisco. We're not at this point certain where this spike was manufactured, whether manufactured in Nevada or in San Francisco and California. It was an iron spike that was silver-plated on the shank, gold-plated on the head, highly engraved. Of the four spikes, this is clearly, to look at, the most beautiful, with much decorative engraving and lettering on it. This spike, we know, at the end of the ceremony, was given to Sidney Dillon, one of the Union Pacific officials there. The reason that we're sure of that is because in the 1940s, his descendant gave the spike to the Museum of the City of New York, and they own it today. So it is still in existence. The San Francisco Newsletter spike is not certain what became of it. It disappears from the record. There is a spike that exists today that may be this spike, but the provenance on it is broken. The owner of it is a collector. He acquired it from a dealer, and there is no provenance on where the dealer got it from. So we can't trace a trail to show that this actually is the spike. The other spikes, we can trace a trail and therefore verify their identity. Also in California, there was a tie, a laurelwood, highly polished laurelwood tie, California laurel. This photograph shows that tie. It was presented by West Evans, who had been a tie contractor for the Central Pacific, had provided a lot of the ties that they used. Highly finished. It had a silver plate with engraving on it. After the ceremony was over, it was turned over to the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific kept it in its headquarters in Sacramento. Headquarters subsequently moved to San Francisco. Along comes a day in April in 1906 called the Earthquake and Fire, and among the things consumed was the Southern Pacific headquarters building with the tie in it. So the tie no longer exists. I talked about the photograph that A. Hart had of the officials after the completion. Here's a close-up in the center, Leland Stanford holding up the silver spike maul, the silver-plated spike maul, I might note. And from its shape, it's actually a boat spike maul used in ship construction, so it would be a little bit lighter weight. To his side is Thomas Durant, Union Pacific Vice President and official, with a normal spike maul, which we might also call a sledgehammer, laying across his shoulder. Next to him are two more officials. Right there is Sidney Dillon holding up his spike. Next to him is John Duff holding up another spike. I do not know, but my guess is that that may be the San Francisco Newsletter spike and that Duff may have ended up with it. But we don't have any history to prove that out at this point. So far, who knows? But who knows? More evidence keeps surfacing. So meanwhile, word is telegraphed to the nation. Celebrations break out from San Francisco to New York to Washington, D.C., Chicago, Philadelphia, Sacramento, all across the country. As I say, the original celebration was supposed to be on May 8th. San Francisco, of course, scheduled a parade and everything. the thing is delayed. Well, they started celebrating on May 8th and just kept celebrating until May 10th. San Francisco was always up for a good party. So a few views afterwards, William Henry Jackson and Ardell Hull visited Promontory in the summer of '69. This is, again, the last spike site. This is looking from the Union Pacific side. You can recognize the hand-hewn ties. The flagpole and telegraph pole mark where the junction is. The boxcar in the background is on Central Pacific track. This is a view looking in the other direction. The junction took place on the Central Pacific alignment. As I said, the two railroads had graded parallel right-of-way for miles in each direction. So the Union Pacific built a spur that came off of their right-of-way and came over onto the Central Pacific right-of-way. That's where the ceremony was held. The cars in the background are on the Union Pacific alignment. A town grew up at Promontory, a temporary town. Promontory remained the junction for the railroad until the fall of late in 1869, when the junction was moved down to Ogden, once an agreement had been reached between the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific on how to make that transfer. So meanwhile, J.B. Silvis, after Russell, J.B. Silvis became an official photographer for the Union Pacific. He had a caboose fitted up as a photograph car. You can see in the lower view. Here he's actually photographing a Chinese section gang at Promontory on the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific also appreciated the work that the Chinese had done and hired a number of them for work. This picture is actually in Weber Canyon, taken in the fall of 1869, and shows a Chinese section crew with their white boss in Weber Canyon on the Union Pacific. As I say, by the end of 1869, the junction had been moved down to Ogden. Here are some early pictures of Ogden and the junction point. In this trackage, the Central Pacific trackage is on the left. The switch stands of the two companies are actually distinguishable from each other. The foreground switch stand with this arched top is a Union Pacific switch stand. In the background back here, that's actually recognizable as a Central Pacific switch stand. So it shows the tracks of the two companies side by side where they can interchange between them. And then the floodgates opened. This picture at Corinne actually shows the Central Pacific immigrant car passing through Corinne. Travel not only from the east to the west, but also from the west to the east. There were many people in California that had been there for many years, but because of the cost and difficulty of getting to the East Coast, had never been back home. Suddenly, the railroad is in place. It's much less expensive, much easier for them to travel. Many of them will travel to the east, some never to return, others just going back for a visit and then returning to California. The railroad opens up the gates for travel and transportation. Artists, again, representations here in the snowy Sierra Nevada mountains with Chinese crews and other crews cheering as the railroad goes by in the grand ethos and vision of people of the time. Guidebooks were produced. Crawford's was one of the most famous. Each year they would produce new guidebooks that people would read that would point out the high points along the travel. When the Central Pacific and Union Pacific was built, the original vision was not only that it would connect the California and the Pacific coast of the United States with the East Coast, but also that commerce from Asia, from China, from Japan, going to Europe would travel over to the coast, take the land bridge across, and then sail on, because at the time, shipping to Europe from Asia had to go around the southern tip of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, a long and arduous voyage. However, they hadn't counted on the Suez Canal. Completed in November of 1869, So the land bridge transit that had been envisioned and the traffic that had been envisioned never materialized. The Suez Canal diverted virtually all of that traffic, the European traffic, and didn't go across the Transcontinental Railroad. 50 years after the completion of the railroad, railroads, the Union Pacific, and by this time Southern Pacific, hold a celebration in Ogden. 3 of the 8 Chinese track layers who laid the last rail were still around and participated in the celebrations. And thanks to the Southern Pacific magazine, we actually have names for those 3 that participated. So not only are they remembered, in this case, they're even named. So May 10th, 1869, the nation turns and all eyes are on the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory, Utah. July 20th, 1969, the world and the nation watches as the first person sets foot on the moon, 100 years later, with a similar kind of attention and focus that had occurred 100 years earlier at Promontory. Meanwhile, today at Promontory, the National Park Service has developed a site there. They have operating replicas of the 2 original locomotives that are steamed up to reenact the ceremonies there, and they do that regularly. And each year on May 10th, they hold a large celebration with full reenactments going on. And that's the end. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions. Oh, yes, sir.
Thank you. Very interesting. I just had a question. You were talking about the transcontinental trip. What was the cost for that when people started going east, and how much time did it take?
I don't know the cost off the top of my head. I've seen those figures, but I don't know what they are. It was, of course, quite a bit less expensive than the earlier things, but you could cross the continent in about 8 days, 8 to 10 days after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and that was a huge time saving. I'll observe that via the Panama route, it was not all that difficult to get from east to west. There are people that I sort of describe as on a commuter schedule between California and the East Coast via the Panama route. And I've got records of people who literally go from California to the East Coast and return to California all within a month's time. So it's a time savings. It's a big time savings and a big cost savings for the Transcontinental Railroad. But it's not as though they were completely isolated before that.
I'd just like to ask you to confirm, it appears that the engine on the one side was definitely wood burning, and I couldn't tell about the other one. Were both of the locomotives initially wood burning at that time?
No, in fact, the Union Pacific locomotive was coal burning. It had screens inside the smoke box and had a straight stack. The Central Pacific locomotive was, in fact, wood burning. Fairly quickly, the Central Pacific adopted, particularly in eastern Nevada, to coal burning because they had access to Wyoming coal. They even had owned some coal mines in Wyoming.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kyle.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.